In this video, I'm going to explore a few of the very ancient pre-Roman sites that archaeologists really don't have an explanation for. They say that they are Roman, early Roman, but in fact there is no evidence in Rome itself of the use of this polygonal architectural style. And this polygonal style is mainly used in sacred places or places that have very special importance. And these range from Circeo in the south of Rome, about 50 kilometers south of Rome, up to Cosa de Ansedonia, which is about 100 kilometers to the north. So it was a very widespread territory that these very ancient people inhabited, yet Rome emerged after them, for there is no evidence of this polygonal style architecture in Rome. If we go by architectural evidence alone, there seems to have been a pre-flood or an antediluvian civilization that shared many architectural forms ranging from Peru to Italy to the Mycenaean civilization in Greece and other places. So it's very interesting that there was some form of stylistic connection between these peoples, which has been lost in terms of the historical or archaeological narrative. And I have no doubt that if there were architectural similarities, there would also have been some spiritual and other similarities as well. For example, finer stonework, of course, implies a place that has a greater sacred importance or is distinguished in some way from the normal day-to-day architecture. So these very beautifully, very finely carved stones that fit perfectly into one another had to have been done for a reason. It wasn't purely utilitarian. A lot of effort was put into making those stones look that way. In places like Machu Picchu and Ollantaytambo in Peru, for example, generally speaking, archaeologists claim that they are Inca structures and that they were built around, let's say, the 1400s. But when one examines those structures more closely, there are certain temples or maybe inner sanctums that are definitely a different building style. The later Inca style was of the more rectangular stonework. The earlier style was much more massive and the forms were much more fluid. And this, of course, leads to the other big question, is how did they, first of all, move those massive stones? And secondly, how did they make those polygonal stones fit one another so perfectly in very odd shapes and without the use of any mortar? And there are some theories around that, perhaps theories that are more unconventional. For example, that the ancients understood how to change the molecular structure of the stone so that it became more like clay and could therefore be molded, then returned to the structure of stone and therefore fitting together so closely. The Great Flood is certainly discussed in mythology, Noah's Ark, the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha in Greek mythology, and there are many other references to this flood. But it does seem that on a scientific level there was some sort of flood about 12 to 14,000 years ago. There is evidence in Canada of the melting of a great ice cap, and there is of course Doggerland, which at one stage connected Britain, the islands of Britain, to Scandinavia. And there is much conjecture that there is actually a hidden, lost civilization in Doggerland, cities, archaeological sites that we have not found, of course, because they are underwater. I've traveled to Peru many times and really love their culture and their architecture. But what really struck me and excited me was when I discovered in Lazio, in Italy, that there are these polygonal stone structures that are very similar to the Peruvian structures. And even more astoundingly to me is these are not really spoken about. And before my trips to Lazio, where I saw these structures, I'd never heard about these polygonal structures in Italy, not even as a comparison to the structures in Peru. When I started researching these structures, first of all, there was very little information about them. And secondly, conventional archaeology claims that these are early Roman. But as I will explore in this video, there is no evidence of the polygonal stonework in Rome itself. So it must have been an earlier form of architectural expression, taking us back to a civilization that's far older than the Romans. There are great differences in timeline. If we conjecture that the Italian polygonal structures are pre-flood, of course the Incas and even the Chavin civilization were much later. Maybe our timelines are mixed up, maybe some of the information is lacking. As happened very clearly in Italy, perhaps the dating of some of these structures was made according to later additions and not the original foundations. At Ollantaytambo and Machu Picchu, there are certainly different layers of architectural styles built at different times. It's very hard to date some of these stone structures. Certainly there is a stylistic way of dating the later Inca structures, which tended to be more rectangular in their style. But those earlier, more organic style stonework of Peru is very hard to date. So there is a kind of blur when it comes to dating these structures, and there does seem to be a very large difference in time between some of them. But on the other hand, I do believe that there was some sort of timeless wisdom, spiritual wisdom, that these people preserved. There was a way of building that was preserved up until very recent history. The departure from this earlier way of building was, of course, the Greek and Roman style in the West, and also the later Egyptian styles. But the early Egyptian styles were very megalithic. I'm here in Palestrina at the sanctuary of the goddess Fortuna, or good fortune, and she's also related to the Egyptian goddess Isis. And I'm here to find evidence of the polygonal architecture that certainly existed here in the area around Rome before the Roman civilization. I had hoped to find some evidence of the massive polygonal stonework here, but this sanctuary of Fortuna is more of an example of early Roman cement work. I'm here in the ancient ruins of Norba, near the city of Norma in Italy, and these ruins are absolutely incredible. Norba was established as a Roman colony around 500 BC, and it has a perimeter wall of about 2.5 kilometers. It's an extremely large precinct, and the inner sanctum, or the main temples at the highest point, are clearly an earlier architectural structure upon which a Roman temple was later built. And as I explored around the site, I soon discovered that underneath that temple, that highest point of the Acropolis, there was also a very large cave structure. For the ancients, the caves were always very sacred. They were the entrance to the underworld. They were a true expression of Mother Earth and of being able to commune with Mother Earth. Unfortunately, this cave is now a pen for goats or sheep, but still maintains some of its great sacredness and raw natural power. Of all the structures that I visited in Italy, Norba is the most similar to the Peruvian style. And although I wouldn't venture to say that they are the same civilization, certainly these polygonal structures were born of necessity. Perhaps they were very good in resisting earthquakes, but I would say on the other hand, there is a certain resonant spiritual aspect to these very beautiful shapes. And in fact, the people really took a delight in building in very complex shapes, which to the modern utilitarian eye might seem quite unnecessary. These stones were special, and therefore I believe that their sacred importance cannot be downplayed. It was in reading about Circeo that I first came across the Italian polygonal or cyclopean walls. And Circeo is on the coast. It is the mythical home of Circe, who was the sorceress that enchanted Odysseus into staying with her for a while. So this land has very powerful mythical connections connected to sorcery. At the time, it was most likely an island because it does stand on a promontory. The Acropolis nowadays seems pretty much destroyed, probably by war or by an earthquake. But the stonework here is amongst the most impressive, even though it is not really intact. I hiked around most of the Circeo area, and I really did not find very much. There were a few sections of walls that were still standing, but one can imagine that in ancient times this was an absolutely spectacular site, with spectacular views over the ocean and surrounding countryside. Alatri is no doubt one of the most spectacular of the sites. It's in the middle of the Frosinone area. It's called the Tellus Saturnia, or the land of Saturn, which was the mythical land ruled by the god Saturn during the Golden Age. The Golden Age being the time when humans were most free and lived in a most ideal state. Alatri and many of the towns surrounding it are built to reflect the constellation of Gemini. And this might be a clue in its dating. If we take the age of Aquarius as being the age that's starting now, according to astrology and the precession of the equinoxes, the age of Gemini would take us back to the period of about 6,000 to 4,000 BC. And that to me makes sense in terms of the dating. One can see these stones are extremely old, they're very worn, and if they are one of these pre-flood civilizations, that connection to the constellations would have been even more important. Even the plan of the Alatri Acropolis resembles the constellation of Gemini. The day that I came here to Alatri, it happens to be a religious festival. So on the one hand, it's amazing because there's this wonderful energy of celebration and aliveness. But on the other hand, it didn't give much time for introspection. But this complex is truly magnificent. It's on a hill surrounded by other mountains, and the most interesting mountains are also on the cardinal points. This is the main entrance into the Acropolis of Alatri, a very sacred space many thousands of years ago, and the stonework here is truly monumental, truly exceptional.
behind me is the omphalos of this sanctuary. It is a polygonal stone with about 10 different sides or angles, and it's at the very point from which all the different gates and orientations of the Alatri, Acropolis, and city are organized. So this is the very center point, and as we can see, it's built on top of some very large stones. So these stones must have represented the energy point which made this a sacred place, and that is the reason why they would have built this temple here. And we can also see that the stonework, which is at the base of the current church, is very fine. So obviously this was where the temple was originally. At first I was a bit disappointed that there's this big festival on here today. But now as I sit at this point, on this omphalos point, and the church bells ring, I can feel the vibrations going right through my body. And these sounds are activating the rock structures, the rock frequency that is inherently part of this. And this temple was built on this particular place because there was already a very powerful frequency coming out of these mountains and hills. I do believe that the festivals, on the one hand, were a celebration of Dionysius, of Bacchus, of vegetation, of renewal, but festivals such as the ringing of the bells and using resonance were also to awaken the energy of the power points upon which some of these temples and churches were built. So today is a very clear manifestation for me of how the bells, the frequencies, the noise, the celebration activates the sacred energies, and that really makes the partnership between humans and the natural world very powerful. So the ancient people of all cultures understood, first of all, that natural places had certain powers, and different mountains or rivers had specific powers. But then if one built a temple or a church there, that would be a way of containing and holding, cultivating and channeling that energy, magnifying it as well for the use of worship, and also as a way to harness these natural energies. Ferentino is about 20 kilometers away from Alatri and is even more beautiful in its medieval and Renaissance architecture. But it also has those incredible megalithic polygonal walls, which I hope to discover on this journey today. Here we can clearly see the different layers, the very old megalithic structures, then the more ordered and rectangular shaped Roman construction, and then later the medieval construction that was plastered on top. Even this example here in Ferentino of the very megalithic structures seems to be of a later date than the polygonal structures, which are more in the so-called Cyclopean style. Having gone to the lower section of this construction, I see that there are the larger megalithic polygonal stonework structures. So certainly the Romans in about the 1st century BC built on a structure that was pre-existing, although there is no explanation or theorizing as to what the civilization was that built these structures before the Romans. The early Roman massive stonework, as we can see here, is also repeated at the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the main temple on the Capitol Hill in Rome. Also very large stones, but not in the polygonal style. Like the other polygonal towns and cities, Segni is on an escarpment overlooking the great plains below, and obviously very well fortified with great abundance in the lands below. Behind me is another example of a church built in the three different eras, with the polygonal blocks at the bottom, then the Roman blocks, and then later the medieval structure for a church. So this was obviously a temple, a pagan temple, before it became a church. Of course, the fact that there was a cistern opposite the temple, which in this case was a temple of Juno Moneta, or Hera, the goddess of love and relationships. It's no coincidence that there was this fountain, because the fountain, of course, represents life and fertility. It also represents relationships and abundance. So this fountain would have been fundamental, of course, in a city like this, but also the fact that it was blessed by being next to a temple, or the temple in fact was placed next to some source of water, is very telling and very interesting. My fascination with these ancient temples and ancient stones is the fact that the people who built these places knew how to hold and contain energy, and these became power points, and they have remained power points. And when we spend time in these sacred sites, when we spend time with these stones that have soaked up these energies for thousands of years, our bodies resonate that same energy. Stone is physical matter. Our physical bodies, our bones, are made up of the same physical matter, and they resonate and speak to one another, the stones and the bones, in order to allow this divine to be experienced on a very visceral level, on a very physical level, so that we can live our spirituality in a very grounded way, in a way that makes us better people, that makes us healthier, that makes us work in the world in a more conscious and fruitful way. Here in Tarquinia, I'm now in Etruscan country, and the Etruscans were pre-Roman, and they obviously influenced Roman civilization in many ways. But it's a very different civilization to the megalithic cities of the Lazio region near Rome. So I'm here to see what I can find in terms of any similarities regarding the Etruscans and that other mysterious race of people from Lazio. The Etruscans are a mystery. Nobody knows really where they came from. Their language hasn't been deciphered. They've left a few traces of themselves. And the very ancient Latins, the people of Lazio, before the Romans, are even more mysterious. There are traces here in this Etruscan region where there are also similar megalithic stones. The Etruscan civilization per se, which started about 800 BCE and lasted until about 300 BCE, also does not actively employ megalithic stonework. So they definitely are a later civilization to the peoples that did the polygonal stonework in this region before them. I am at the city of Cosa, later called Cosa by the Romans, but the stonework here is clearly very similar to the stonework in Circeo and Alatri, for example, but also very different to the Etruscan stonework. So it does seem that this is part of that same civilization that was pre-Roman and certainly pre-Etruscan. These walls, which define an incredibly large perimeter, are not only about fortification. They certainly are a statement of power on the one hand, and certainly they are about symbolizing the sacred space or the defined space of the city and the identity of the people that lived here. Behind me we can see the traditional or later Roman way of doing stonework, which was very rough with smaller stones and certainly not the close-fitting polygonal forms. This wall would have been covered with plaster or otherwise faced with marble. Here within the same structure we can see the two different types of stonework, which for me implies different eras of building and adding to existing structures. These polygonal stones compared to the broken stones held together with mortar have a very different energy. They seem to resonate, they seem to flow and harmonize together with one another, whereas the broken stones are just that, broken stones. So there's definitely, for me personally, a feeling of greater harmony, of greater connection. Again, that cultivation of a natural form, a natural stone, into something that humans work with and use for sacred work and practice. Behind me are the remains of the Capitolium, which is the temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the triad of the Romans. But what's very interesting here is we can see the later temple that was built on the base of the polygonal blocks. This, like most of the ancient temple structures, is always so inspiring. It's always so palpable, the energy here of not only the divine, not only Mother Earth expressing itself through its stones, through its plants, but then the extra element that humans have added through the buildings first of all, and then second of all through the continued worship and the continued cultivation of these sacred spaces. This arx or acropolis in Cosa, of course, is the highest point of the city, the place closest to the heavens and with an incredible view over the surrounding ocean. The temple of Jupiter was built in about the 6th century BC, and the polygonal structures outside of Rome were allegedly built around the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. To me, that kind of doesn't make sense, especially given the fact that the polygonal structures are not found here in Rome, which was supposed to be the epicenter and the source of wealth. So it really is my belief that these polygonal structures were built by another culture and that Rome rose later and built on top of the existing structures. The question is, who were these other people, this other civilization? Interestingly, the only examples of polygonal stonework in Rome itself are the roads. And even these polygonal stones are not very finely finished off.
So who these people were that built these structures in Italy is a mystery, and when they built them is even more of a mystery. So this culture came before. It's hard to know where they came from, but in my opinion there are two theories or possibilities that make sense. The first one is that Italy was part of another civilization, perhaps the civilization of Atlantis, that came to an end possibly 10,000 years BC. My other theory, which I'll explain later, is that given the fact that Alatri is built to reflect the constellation of Gemini, the age of Gemini took place around 6,000 to 4,000 BC. Perhaps it was built in that age when the energy of Gemini was prominent. It's not too outlandish to conjecture that perhaps Italy or the Western Mediterranean was the Atlantis that the ancients spoke about. Circeo proposes that the original pillars of Hercules were between Sicily and North Africa. In modern days, or in later times during the Greek and the Roman civilization, the pillars of Hercules were considered to be at modern Gibraltar. But if we conjecture that those pillars of Hercules were in Sicily, that would make a lot of sense, that Italy was in fact the lost Atlantis. Not necessarily a full continent that sank, as Plato suggests, but vast swathes of coastline, great cities that were submerged by the floods. And of course, the floods were very much due to the melting of the ice caps in Europe and in other places. So this idea of a pre-flood civilization being destroyed by the rising water levels is not too outlandish if we consider the great ice cap that covered Europe up until maybe about 10,000 years ago. It is my belief that we could perhaps date Alatri and other sites in Frosinone to the age of Gemini, which last time around was about 6,000 before Christ. But before that, it was 30,000 years before Christ, which could be another alternative dating. And certainly these stones are very worn and very old. These different astrological ages are always characterized by the presence of the symbols of the astrology science in the art and the culture of the peoples. So for example, the age of Taurus, which was about 4 to 2000 BC, has the preeminence of the bull in cultural and spiritual rites. And this we see, of course, in India with the sacredness of the bull and its relationship to Shiva, and the god Dionysius, who is also linked to Shiva in very many symbolic ways, as a god of fertility, as a god of ecstasy. The symbol of Dionysius is also the bull. The age of Pisces, which was the age from the year 0 to present times, is symbolized by the fish, and that of course is one of the symbols of Christianity. So in short, the ancient structures in Italy may have been pre-flood, they may have been built during the age of Gemini, but whatever the case, they were built long before the Romans. The Romans repurposed the foundations and the walls that were handed down to them. But for me, it's a shame that these polygonal structures in Italy, which have such similarities with Peru, are not better investigated by the conventional and non-spiritual archaeological institutions. What does it matter if there were these pre-Roman civilizations or peoples that built these very interesting temples, very interesting cities? For me, I come to realize that it's about the fact that we have great gaps in our understanding of our history. And in order for us to know who we really are as humans, spiritual humans, we need to know where we come from and what was possible before. So when we can remember who we have been and what great deeds and feats we've done in the past, we can reclaim those powers and take them into the future.